Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the Oakland History Center's Fall History Series. My name is Emily Foster, and I am a librarian here at the Oakland History Center at Oakland's main library. This is our 5th program in the series this year. And if you've missed any of the others, you can find recordings on the Oakland History Events page on our beautiful new website. And I'm going to put the link in the chat here. And at that link, you can also register for a program that's happening tomorrow night, which is called Skyrider, Park Van Tassel and the Rise of Ballooning in the West. That's with author Gary Fogel, who's written a book about early aeronautics pioneer who lived in Oakland, Park Van Tassel. And that will be the last program in the series for this year. So don't miss it. But if you do, check back in a few days and you'll be able to find recordings on that Oakland History Events page. So tonight we have Professor Bertram Gordon with us to talk about the history and legacy of Mills College. So Mills College is actually as old as the city of Oakland itself. Both of them were founded in 1852. So Mills is Oakland's oldest continuously operating educational institution. So as you can imagine, we do have some resources here in the Oakland History Center about Mills. And we're open to the public, so you're welcome to stop by anytime and research Mills or any other thing about Oakland that you're interested in. We've got all sorts of things here. And you've probably heard about Mills quite a lot in the news recently, because in March of this year, they announced that they would no longer be enrolling new first-year students after fall 2021, and that they would most likely be giving out their final degrees in 2023. And since then, there have been more reports of negotiations and lawsuits. But currently, it looks like Mills is on its way to merging with Northeastern University. And I'm not going to go too much into that, but I just want to say that news of the fact that Mills might be like entering a new chapter is what inspired us to have a program sort of honoring the history of Mills so far. So Professor Gordon is Professor Emeritus of History at Mills. And when we were looking for someone to present on the history of Mills, we were told he is the person to do it. He specializes in European history. He's been at Mills since 1969. And he is also, besides European history, also taught a course on the history of Mills College at Mills every few years since 2002. And from speaking to him just a little bit and seeing some of the materials from his course, it's really clear that he has just a wealth of knowledge about Mills. So I'm excited for him to share some of that with us tonight. And just a few housekeeping things before we get started. We are going to have time for questions partway through the program and again at the end. So if you would like to either wait and hold your questions, you're welcome to do that. Or if you want to type them into the chat, I can be monitoring the chat and I'll go back and read them out when we're at the Q&A portion. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Bertram Gordon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Am I on? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Also for the invitation to talk about the history of Mills. And as Emily said, I've been at Mills for quite some time, so some of that history is personal history as well. I will try not to make this all personal history, but I will start by telling you, since Emily mentioned that my major research area has been European history, primarily French history for the last decades, you might say, how I ended up doing the history of Mills very, very briefly. For 2 years, from 1999 to 2001, I was acting provost there. And then at the end of 2001, the president of the college said, well, for all your work, we would give you a year off to year sabbatical, basically. So there are two little parts to this story. One is fine, we took advantage to go to France, and we flew to France on September 11th, 2001, which had its own exciting story, but that's for another occasion. Anyway, during the year I was in France, we came back around Christmas time to visit family and of course to visit Mills as well. And I was told the president wanted to see me. Okay, fine. Well, Mills was getting ready to celebrate its sesquicentennial the next year. And as Emily mentioned, the college, actually the Young Ladies Seminary in Benicia, the ancestor, if you like, of the college, which I'll say a few words about in a moment, was established in 1852. So this was going to be the 150th anniversary. And she said, well, we'd like you to teach a course in the history of Mills College. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And the cliche, when the boss tells you something, you say, yes, of course. I said, yes. I was on an airplane the next day back to France, wondering how am I supposed to do the research on the history of the Mills College from France. To make a long story short, we did what we could, taught the course. It was a lot of fun. The students seemed to be interested. And so, as Emily mentioned, I sort of incorporated it into the courses that I would do every couple of years. What I'm going to do now is to share the screen and be able to see the PowerPoint, hopefully. Tell me if there's any problems, somebody, but I think we're okay. So what I want to do is sort of a little run through. Let's hang on for a second. Okay, I'm assuming you can see everything. That it's here, it's see, all that. Okay, a little run. Good. Okay, thank you. A little run through what I'm calling the history and legacy of Mills. And of course, it is very much tied in to Oakland and its history. How could it not be? Although ironically, when Mills first came to Oakland in 1871, and more about this in just a minute or two, the part of Oakland, which now we would call East Oakland, where the campus was situated, was not actually in the city of Oakland. It was in Brooklyn. I found that out shortly after I arrived at Mills. There was a reception at the president's house, and there was an old picture of the campus, and it said Brooklyn. I had come previously, a month or two before, from Brooklyn, New York, and it just seemed, oh, I went through a lot of effort not to go very far geographically. Anyway, for those of you not familiar with the campus, and I will extend an invitation for all of you, if you're Oaklanders, if you're not familiar with the campus, you will be welcome there, I am sure. I've given tours of the campus, historical tours, other sorts of tours. There are a lot of people interested in the campus. It's a gorgeous campus. As you can see, this is the entry, the main entrance, and the welcome to Mills. And you pass through a security gate, and then you can just ride around or walk around the campus. In my first visit, before I actually accepted the position, I came out for an interview and went back to New York, and people asked me, well, what is it like out there? What does Mills look like? And all I could think of to say, it's a college set in a botanical garden. It's really a pleasure to be there. And that hasn't changed for me in all these years. So again, I invite you to come and join. Okay, well, as I said before, and as as Emily indicated, I was thinking of Mary Atkins, the history of the college begins with the Young Ladies Seminary, which opened in Benicia, up in Solano County, by Mary Atkins, who was an educator who came from Oberlin College herself. And she opened the seminary. This is the Randall House, which she acquired the early 1850s. And as you see, named for a captain who specialized in trade between San Francisco and Panama. She acquired this, and this was the totality of the seminary. And understand it was a seminary. It met a certain need at the time, and for a number of decades after. It's right after the gold rush in California, 1852 again. You have people coming in to settle, not only people seeking gold, but people who come in and recognize that there are opportunities here. We could set up businesses, open up shops, service the people who are looking for gold. And of course, San Francisco grows in many other areas in California, including what's now the East Bay. So what Mary Atkins recognized was a need on the part of these families for places to educate their daughters, where they're going to educate their daughters. And this was essentially the mission, if you like, of the Young Ladies Seminary. So it is launched in 1852 in Benicia, And it goes through a history of several years, and I'll just go over it very, very quickly. Essentially, the mission was defined as being for the daughters of the pioneers, people coming and settling in the area of Northern California, the area of present-day Northern California. And that was the first few years, the mission of the first few years. Mary Atkins actually decided to do other sorts of projects. And in 1866, she turned it over to Cyrus and Susan Mills. And obviously they recognize the names. There are pictures of Cyrus and Susan Mills in various places on the campus. They're honored essentially as the founders of the college. Although it's a little bit more complicated than just that, as we will see. So in 1865, the mid-1860s, they're missionaries in what's now Hawaii, the Sandwich Islands, and they're returning to the mainland, and they purchased a seminary from Mary Atkins. And one of the things I found out in doing research about the Mills, both of them, Cyrus and Susan, is that yes, they were missionaries, they were oriented toward religion and religious studies, they were very good business people too. And ultimately they recognized, they have to have recognized the future development of the area where the present campus is, because they ultimately bought that and moved the school to the present location. So this is 1865. Just to finish the story of Mary Atkins, it's kind of interesting. And in doing research for the Mills history that I've done over the last few years, I found a couple of stories that aren't really told all that much at Mills. At Mills itself, if you're a student, faculty, staff, whatever, you go to meetings, you hear about the history of the college. The focus is on the seminary, moving to Oakland, becoming the college, and the story, of course, of Cyrus and Susan Mills. What you don't hear a lot about is that Mary Atkins left, and then she came back and reacquired the seminary, and actually kept the seminary there and kept it going until 1886. So that in a sense, you had two seminaries, because what happens with the Mills is they moved to Oakland, to the present location, and Mills is still a seminary. And then in 1885, a college is chartered. So you actually have two institutions on the Mills campus from mid-1860s, really through 1911. It is only in 1911 that the seminary is closed. And that's unusual for women's colleges. A number of women's colleges in the East started out as seminaries. And when they became colleges, the administrators, the people running them, relatively quickly closed the seminaries and focused on the college life and the college aspect of the institution. It was a little bit different with Mills. So this is Cyrus and Susan Mills, who you're seeing here. Since we're talking to library people and people, some of you in the audience, I suspect we're interested in archives and how do you get this kind of information? There's a lot of material on the history of the college in the library at Mills, the Mills Library. There is material, as Emily mentioned, in the Oakland Public Library, some of which a number of years ago I was privileged to see. The Alumni House on campus also has material and artifacts. And what you're looking at is a trunk belonging to Cyrus T. Mills, which presumably came with him from Honolulu, SI, Sandwich Islands, now Hawaii, to Mills, to the new campus. This is a photo that I took in quite a number of years ago when I was putting some of these things together. And now in Reinhardt Alumni House, and I'll have a lot to say about Reinhardt in a little while. So this is one of the accoutrements, you might say. And then again, looking at the campus at the very beginning. So in 1871, as I mentioned, the Mills moved to the present location. The estimates that I've seen are that there were about 100 students, give or take, in collectively the seminary and the college. And that figure seems to hold relatively stable for a number of years. The first building built is Mills Hall, and this is still the really administrative center of the college. It still exists today. It was damaged in the 1906 earthquake, and this cupola that you see at the top was removed after the 1906 earthquake for fear that it would come tumbling down. It had been damaged in 1906. It was damaged again during the Loma, not the cupola, of course, but the building, during the Loma Prieta earthquake and 1989. And there was some discussion at the time of whether it paid, whether or not to try to invest the funds to rebuild, restructure the building, or maybe just remove it and put up something new. And as it turned out, of course, by the time of Loma Prieta, almost everybody associated with Mills College in one way or another, of course, thought of Mills Hall. And so the decision was made, of course, to keep Mills Hall. And it took a couple of years of construction and whatever, and offices were moved. There were classrooms, and now, of course, the building has been restored. And so again, there were offices. The president's office is right down here, the provost's office up here. Second floor, there are classrooms. When Mills Hall was built in 1871, as you can see from this picture, it was the totality of the campus. Not only the offices and classrooms, but the dormitories. People lived there. And the total student body, everybody connected with the college was living in this building. So this is 1871. One of the earliest buildings is Sage Hall, named for Sarah Sage, the daughter of Russell Sage, who was a donor to the college in the early days. This was the first library, the Sage Library. And you can see the books over here. You can see the high ceiling over there. This building is still open. It's been added on to over the years. It's now used, this part of it is primarily a public hallway, and you can go in this direction, and it's much more extensive, and there are offices, and you go to the right, and there are a couple of offices as well. But in 1893, when this picture was taken, it was the library, the totality of the library. So again, I'll focus on some of the buildings to give you a feel for the college, and we'll look again at the early days. The college gets its charter in 1885. And here's a picture again near the entrance to Mills, to the college in 1888, 3 years later. And you can see once again, looming in the background is Mills Hall. There's the cupola that I mentioned before. To place this for you, where would this be now? This would be now towards Seminary Avenue. In front of the college is an oval. It's still in many ways considered the center of the campus. The campanile or the bell tower wasn't yet built. We'll talk, that's over here. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. And off to the side, you have essentially countryside. And here you have the young women playing croquet. And again, you can see the social activity reflecting the mission of the college. Again, for the daughters of fairly affluent, they're not necessarily gold prospectors by the 1880s, but fairly affluent mercantile, educational groups and others looking for a place to send their daughters when there aren't really a lot of opportunities for them. So again, we're looking at the 1880s. Here we're looking at something of a map, a sort of reconstituted map, 1885, the campus in 1885. And I'll just point out a couple of things. What the map shows is some of the present day streets as well. So here's Seminary Avenue, and the picture that you just saw would have been somewhere right around here. Of course, Oakland, these neighborhoods aren't developed until the early part of the 20th century. So once again, just to go back again, when you look around, you see the hills, of course, in the back. It's all countryside. It's all trees. There is nothing else. We have aerial photographs that show this even more strikingly. And so these students were there really in their own village, so to speak, surrounded by beautiful country. So looking at the 1885 map with a couple of comments to make. Here's Mills Hall. Here's the oval that I mentioned before. Here's the creek that runs through Lake Aliso up on top, and just beyond sort of the eastern edge of the college, just before you really get into the hills. And people would go and have parties and ceremonies at Lake Aliso all the way through, really all the way through the 1930s and 40s. Again, in the college's archives, you can find find pictures of these again. Excuse me. And then you have here Beulah Road. This is an old road that sort of went through the college. And if you wanted to come to the campus from somewhere other than the immediate vicinity, you came most likely by train. The map, of course, shows the present and shows the freeways up here, the 580 MacArthur Freeway. But of course, this wasn't there at the time. So you took the train from San Francisco or from the center of Oakland, and you can see the various stops here. Ming Kwang Home for Chinese Orphans was put together in 1923. That building was part of the campus. It was taken over by the college. It's now used by the Julia Morgan School for Girls. It's sort of rented from the college. Here's the Beulah station on Beulah Road, and then here's the Mill station. And so what you would do is you would take the train, presumably from center of Oakland, let's say downtown Oakland, get off at the Mill station, and then walk down from the Mill station, walk down more or less this way along what became Capulani Road to Mills Hall. So this was really the axis. And this is important because the center of the campus was Mills Hall. And just to give you an example of how this affected the architecture, the theater on the campus is Lisser Hall. And I'm assuming that some of you in the audience may have seen Lisser Hall. I know we have at least a couple of students, one former student will obviously be familiar with Lisser Hall, but some of you who may not have actually had an affiliation with Mills and who've visited the campus have probably seen Lisser Hall. This is what it looks like now. And the picture up on the left, the upper left, is 1902. Shortly after the theater opened, it was built to be the theater. Named for Louis Lisser. I have some comments about him in just a moment. And you can see the sign Lisser Hall. And the students, they're dressed up for a dramatical presentation. Well, when Lisser Hall was first opened, I'm going to try to go back now. When Lisser Hall was first opened, it's sort of right around here. The front of it faced this way. It faced Mills Hall. This was the center of the campus, and it made sense to have the front facing where the center of the campus would be. By the time we get to the 1920s and 30s, and we'll see this in just a moment, there's more construction and more buildings, dormitories being built up along this area, along Richards Road. President's house is going to be up here. So there's going to be a little bit more activity, a growing amount of activity here. And so the decision was made in the late 1920s. The building, Lisser Hall, needed a renovation anyway. And so the decision was made essentially to turn the building around. And in effect, it was. And if you wander around the campus today, here's the front of it, Richards Road. If you walk to the back, you can still see some evidence of what was the original entrance. And of course, there's a service entrance for people who are working there, but you can still see something of the original entrance to Lisser Hall. So it's kind of a way in which a building was turned around as the campus grew and evolved. A couple of buildings that are no longer there. This is the Nathaniel Gray Hall of Science, dedicated in 1892. Photo is from 1938. It was demolished in 1960. It was replaced by early 1960s by a classroom building, a sort of modern classroom building. And I included this because the comment was kind of interesting. A former student, an alum from the year 1958, in a letter to the Mills Quarterly, it's the Mills alumni magazine, essentially, who was writing about this building and how she especially enjoyed the little piece. She was writing about Nathaniel Gray Hall in response to an article about it in the Quarterly. And as she writes, she enjoyed the little piece about the Nathaniel Gray Hall, et cetera. My roomie, that's the phrase that was used. In other words, it's the students roomed together. They usually were two. My roomie and I had our audiovisual aids class there and were fascinated by the oldness of it. It loomed so big and foreboding. And this picture doesn't really do quite justice to how dark it really looked. But once we got inside, she's saying it was friendly and interesting and all of that. And the interactions with the campus over and over again, and now speaking just from personal experience, my own experience, but also talking to people over the years and right up to the present, you ask them what do they like about the college, students, people who work there and staff, faculty. And over again, one of the things that comes up right away is the campus. Well, a little bit about the life of the young women who were there. This is the seminary basketball team. Now, this was not the college basketball team, but the seminary. Remember, you have a seminary and a college coexisting in the same campus, and really through 1911. So basketball had become, by the middle of the 1890s, the most popular sport at Mills. And this is what you looked like if you were a young woman on the Mills Seminary basketball team in 1894. And so there was a gym, and they'd play basketball and play against other local institutions. And so what we think of as college sports was definitely a factor. And I would say really all the way through, really even up to the present, well, let's say up to the COVID pandemic, certainly, one of the attractions for students once they arrive at Mills is to be able to participate in sports and athletics. And it's not a major university where you have to be a star to be on a football team or something. The athletic programs are designed really to be open and available to all the students, and many of them take advantage of them. And I certainly, and I think anyone else on the faculty, I've heard other people say this too, encourage the students to do this. Don't spend all your time inside studying and at the computer. Go out and do something physical. And walking, hiking was very popular. And prior to the freeway, the students would go and hike up into the hills. The freeways, of course, sort of put an end to that. More about that as we go along. 1904, the construction of the bell tower, or the campanile, different spellings, El Campanile as it's known. And this is opposite the Oval from Mills Hall. And you can see an older picture of it here. It's a 1904 picture of it. This is the Oval. You sort of walk around the Oval. And as I've indicated, the bells that were made, there are 10 bells altogether. You can't see them all, but there are a couple of them here and then more up on top. One down here as well. They were made for the exposition of 1893 in Chicago and then given to Mills by a trustee. The campanile is famous for a number of reasons, and one is it was designed by Julia Morgan. And Julia Morgan was and remains a very well-known architect who designed quite a number of buildings at Mills. This was a day around the turn of the century, of the last century, when there weren't really all that many women architects, so women were doing these kinds of projects. She designed the campanile with reinforced concrete, which meant that it withstood, it was damaged somewhat, but it withstood, as I mentioned before, the 1906 earthquake. And the bells, the dedication was 10 bells named for the spirits, the graces of the spirit from St. Paul's. And one year, it must be about 10 or 15 years ago, when I was doing the Mills history course, I managed to get the plant people to allow us, meaning the class, to actually go up to the top and see these bells in person. And it was really quite an experience. I think it was special for the students. We had something like 20 people in the class, and they could only go up in groups of 3 or 4. So what I did was told the students we'd meet outside and conducted the class more or less downstairs outside, and then groups of 3 would go up. And these were students, of course, many of them residential students on campus. They saw the campanile every day, and yet to go up to the top of it was really a special treat. And from the top of it, you get quite a view of the rest of Oakland, the flatlands of Oakland, and the bay in San Francisco, depending, of course, on which way you look. So the campanile, a major aspect of the of not only the campus, but campus life. Okay, a couple more of the older buildings. Margaret Carnegie Library, which still exists. This became the library, and after 1906, Sage Library that I showed you before got to be too small. This library, Margaret Carnegie, was designed to hold 40,000 books. Ultimately, in the years since then, 2 new libraries have been built, one next to it, adjacent to it, sort of down here, which also turned out to be too small by about 20 years ago. And so the present library was built. I'll show that to you toward the end. So there actually are 4 locations on the campus now that have served at one time or another as the library. This building is now used for offices of different kinds, as is the library that replaced it. So to go inside, the interior room, named the Albert Bender Room. Albert Bender was a collector of art and old documents who donated quite a number of these to the library. And so this became the special collections room for years and years. Occasionally there would be meetings up here as well, small meetings. And I mentioned the source for some of the information. Should you ever be interested, Rosalind Keep, who worked at Mills for decades, wrote a book on the history of the college called Fourscore, History of Mills College. It was published in 1931. It was republished in the early 40s. So obviously, I don't recommend it as a book to give you the whole history of the college because we've had a lot of time pass since then. But it's really excellent reading. She obviously loved the place, and excellent reading for the early history of the college. And she spends quite a bit of time talking about the Margaret Carnegie Library. This is where you went if you were a student and you needed to consult books. Remember, no internet. Don't look for the internet stations in the Margaret Carnegie Library. You might find one or two now. So a couple of comments. This is an article from Overland in 1920, I believe it's 1925. My talking sign is covering the year, talking about the library. And I took a sentence from it. Overland was a local publication which had quite a number of articles about mills in the 19-teens and 1920s, local in Oakland, that is. There was a time when books were considered too precious for the ordinary student, and for years, the Oxford University Library was open only to graduates who had spent 8 years in the study of philosophy. For 3 centuries, these volumes were chained to the shelves lest one be stolen or misplaced. And of course, this was true. And going back prior to the invention of movable type and printing, these were manuscripts and even more rare. That, of course, precedes Mills' history. So there's a long history of the book involved in there. And I might just add, Mills has a program and courses in the history of the book, which are quite interesting. Below, a little section taken from the catalog, what was life like for the students there? Well, 1908, 1909, you can imagine the parietal rules. The phrase that was used not only at Mills, but in a lot of colleges and universities, you may be familiar with in Latin, was in loco parentis. It's been used for other schools, other levels of school too, meaning in the place of the parents. And especially at a college like Mills, where the students were living on the campus. We now have at Mills a large percentage of students who live off campus, older students who come back. That's a whole different world, and we'll talk a little bit about that toward the end. But imagine they're all young women, virtually all young women. They're all living on the campus in Mills Hall, and then eventually there'll be some more dormitories. So students are permitted from time to time to attend entertainments of various kinds, concerts, lectures, the best theaters in Oakland, Berkeley, and San Francisco, but they have to take a chaperone with them. Accepting women of the upper division in college, those would be what we would call today the juniors and seniors. In other words, not the seminary people and not the first year and second year college students. No student is permitted at any time to go from the college or return to the college unaccompanied. So this is your in loco parentis, and this of course will change as time goes on. So moving ahead, again, looking at the campus, I mentioned the Gymnasium, another Julia Morgan structure, 1910, in Spanish colonial revival style. This was demolished just about 1960, late 1950s, and it's the site now of the present day tea shop. So again, it's a real social gathering place for not only students, but faculty and staff. People go get lunch there. And there's a plaza outside. For decades, there was a swimming pool here. It was built here when the gymnasium was torn down, and then the swimming pool was removed when a new swimming pool was built elsewhere on the campus. People used to wonder about the etiquette of having a swimming pool right next to the tea shop where people would be eating their lunch, watching the other people swimming in the pool. Anyway, part of the history of Mills, as I indicated at the beginning, this is an institution with a rich history. So a couple of points to make, and I just put this on a text so you can see it as well. that when we're looking, and let's say the first half of the 19th century, especially the 1920s, 30s, et cetera, you have a situation where the numbers of colleges are relatively stable and the population is growing rather dramatically. In 1942, only 20% of the US population finished high school, 2% in college. That meant a huge market for colleges and universities. And there were no more colleges available in 1940 than in 1890. And this helps explain the huge growth of colleges, big universities. Just look at UC Berkeley, for example, in the area, in the period beginning with the middle of the 20th century, which we'll come to. But looking now in the late 19th, early 20th century, you didn't travel very far. You couldn't travel very far. Air transport was it was expensive. It was relatively inaccessible. So your marriage and friendship circles, and this is how students tend to select their colleges and universities, or remain loyal to their colleges and universities, built around regional parities, Harvard and Radcliffe, Stanford and Mills. And I remember talking to people, women who were at Mills, let's say even in the middle of the 20th century, and men at Stanford talking about how the guys from Stanford would come down to Mills and meet the women at Mills. And there were any number of marriages between Stanford men and Mills women. Again, that has changed dramatically. And as I've indicated in the text here, the Regents is self-maintaining because air travel existed, of course, but not meaningfully, not really. Life expectancy increases. And so the result of all of this is you've got, as I wrote here, a big funnel into the small liberal arts colleges. This period of time coincides with the presidency of Aurelia Reinhardt. And here you see Aurelia Reinhardt, and you see her years president of Mills from 1916 to 43. And I would argue that it's really Aurelia Reinhardt who, I won't say single-handedly, but to a large degree, it is she and her presidency that created the college as it exists now. So just some statistics, for example, the campus had 11 buildings when she arrived and 28 when she left, when she retired. Enrollment goes from 100 to about 600. She eliminated sororities, in other words, and establishing the Associated Students of Mills College. In other words, uniting the students, the social activities of the students around the college, diversifying the curriculum. And I've just given a couple of examples on this image. Spanish offered for the first time meaningfully, a chair of American history, anthropology. There were quite a number of others as well. The School of Education, School of Graduate Studies created under her presidency. And as the last line, Mills made it through 2 world wars, First and Second World War, under her presidency, and it wasn't really always that easy. But there's no way to overemphasize, in my view, the importance of Aurelia Reinhardt in the history of the college. So just to show you some of the structures that she's to a large degree responsible for: Orchard House, a student residence hall, 1919. And some of these images I got from Karen Feeney, who's the campus architect. So a shout out to Karen Feeney. Thank you very much. My thanks to Karen. The Orchard House, endowment funds being raised in the early 20s, 1925, the opening of the art gallery, which is now the Art Museum, which is actually exactly what you're looking at here, except this was the president's house. So they moved the president's house across to the other side of the brook and built the current art museum as well. And especially if you haven't visited the campus, the art museum, I'll put in a plug. They often have they usually have very interesting exhibits going on, and always you're welcome. Okay, 1933, you're looking at Ethel Moore, one of the largest dormitories. And again, you listen to students, and I'm thinking of alums I've talked to who were students in Ethel Moore. This is a huge building, and you can get lost in it very easily. And one of the things that I've sometimes been asked to talk about, and it's been on my mind recently because I was just asked a few days ago with Halloween coming up, are the ghosts, because there are all sorts of stories about the ghosts haunting these buildings. And Ethel Moore has no shortage of ghosts, people, students telling stories, former students telling stories. Not so long ago either, the ones that I collected a few years ago, former students telling stories about being alone in a study room and looking up and there's another woman sitting there reading a book and then looking up again and that other woman is gone, these types of stories. So this is Ethel Moore. The Stables, 1938, the growth, and you see the women on horseback. And again, I remind you, this was prior to the freeways going in. Now the stables were right across on the bay side of where Freeway 580 is. And of course, you know, Freeway 580 and Freeway 13 sort of diverge right around that point. These freeways weren't there. So the students could get on their horseback, do equestrian lessons and equestrian classes and go up into the hills on horseback. And they often did, and they could picnic and they had their horse training classes there, etc. Again, the old mills, the early years. This is a picture of some of the students. And again, a shout out to Amelia Marshall, who's a local equestrian person and very familiar with the history of the mill's equestrian system, so to speak, and the stables, etc. And she was kind enough to let me have a couple of pictures. You're looking at one of them here, and you can see them dressed up. This would be in the 1940s. Roy Partridge, famous photographer, his wife, Imogen Cunningham, Roy Partridge, Imogen Cunningham, equally famous photographer. This is a whole series of photos that Partridge took from mills from 1920 really through 1954. He was the director of the art gallery for 12 years. The Halls in the Hills, it's called Record of a Campus. And if you're ever interested in doing research among these pictures, and it's quite a lovely collection, you have to go to UC Berkeley. They're in the Bancroft Library, UC Berkeley. But this gives you a little feeling for what the campus looked like. Sort of in the middle of the 20th century, with the hills, the trees, the hills behind, the trees on both sides. Really, as I said at the beginning, a college, a campus set in a botanical garden. Going on through the 30s and into the early 40s, of course, we come into the Second World War. And that really opened mills to something of a new page in its history, because you get a number of refugees from fascist and Nazi Europe coming to the United States, and mills isn't the only institution that benefits from this, but a number of them end up at mills. And perhaps the most famous of them is Darius Milhaud, the composer. You see pictured here with Fernand Léger, Léger, and a painter, an artist. Here you see Milhaud. I hope you can see the cursor. Léger and André Maurois. Maurois, a writer, very well-known French writer in the middle of the 20th century. And these people, of course, fleeing France was occupied in 1940 by Nazi Germany. And so here you have one of Léger's magnificent constructions, painted constructions on exhibit at mills. And here's Milhaud as well. Anyway, these people came and Mills was very receptive to them. And the story is told sort of jokingly, but I remember hearing this story quite a number of years ago from an older colleague, excuse me, pardon me, something in the throat, that Aurelia Reinhardt would go down to the pier and collect these people as they were coming off the boat. Now, it's obviously a bit of an overstatement, but she was very sensitive to the fact to how much they could add to mills. And so music programs take off, art programs, painting, etc., photography programs, as all these people come to mills. And mills, by the middle to late 1940s, becomes well known across the United States, and I would even say internationally, as an art school for the fine arts. Let me put it that way, fine art school. So its reputation, you see, shifts a little bit. I had the real pleasure, the distinct honor of spending some time meeting Madeleine Milhaud, the widow of Darius Milhaud, in Paris a number of years ago. She passed away it's about 10 years ago now that she passed away. She was 105 or 106 when she passed away. And she had stories, of course, of what it was like to pull up stakes and readjust at a small American liberal arts women's college, and how welcoming everybody was. And the campus had and still has faculty housing. Part of the campus is devoted to units of faculty housing. The Mios were given a place to live on campus. You will see this in just a moment. This is their faculty house. And here you have the Mios in the center, Darius Mio, and there's Madeline Mio, with Igor Stravinsky on the left and Nadia Boulanger on the right. So this is just a little example of the hosting of really internationally known figures in the fine arts. And so for a period thereafter, this is Mills' claim to fame, you might say. The war goes on, and again, there's a lot one could say, but very briefly, you can see ships named for colleges. This is a stamp of SSS Mills Victory, launched in March of 1945, toward the end of the war. Mary Woods Bennett, who was provost at Mills for decades, starting in the Mary Woods Bennett started, forgetting the exact year, but she retired in the 70s, and she started as provost. It's got to be in the mid-50s. She wrote accounts of the history of Mills, and she wrote about how Aurelia Reinhardt would go out of her way to protect Japanese students and Japanese American students from internment, and the fights that she had with the various governmental agencies during the war, when the people of Japanese background were being interned in California, as some of you may know. And again, Reinhardt moved heaven and earth to protect the Mills people who she knew. Okay, we'll move on. Following the war, after the mid-century, things change. Population growth slows, and educational institutes are increasing at a much more rapid pace. By the 1960s, the government, federal government, and then state government is giving loans to get people into colleges. There are all sorts of bills that have passed to fund public universities, to fund scholarships, et cetera. And what happens is higher status for many of these programs, including graduate schools. I've mentioned just a few here. The UC system, for example, UC Berkeley, UCLA, and the other University of California campuses, places like the University of Michigan, University of Illinois, I could name others as well. And some of them set up overseas campuses. My point being that the competition for a decreasing number of college-age students is increasing. Friendships built in larger geographical circles. So, you go to UC Berkeley or somewhere and you take your spring break in Fort Lauderdale. And this isn't to say that some Mills students didn't do this, or students from other small liberal arts colleges, but it's becoming harder and harder. You go overseas to their campus in Europe, for example. I was just reading something online today, unrelated to my talk, but just something University of Chicago. Somebody's giving a talk where University of Chicago has a campus in Paris. So that's where the talk is being given. Older people are returning to school, and they're going to community colleges, night school, adult school, et cetera. The large universities get into this. And perhaps most importantly for a women's college like Mills, women now have access, as I've indicated here, at low cost, to these high status schools, the ones that I was mentioning before. And this causes a real crisis, major problems for the women's colleges. The situation is changing. Picture that you're looking at here is Kathleen Dalton, who was one of my students when I first came to Mills. She graduated in 1970. And Kathy went on to get a PhD in American history at Johns Hopkins. And she wrote this huge book, a wonderful book, Theodore Roosevelt, A Strenuous Life. Kathy was on a trip. She lives in Massachusetts. She was teaching at Phillips Academy in Exeter, Massachusetts. And she was on a trip across the country in 2002 promoting her book, giving book talks, and contacted Mills and, could I do a book talk at Mills? And as soon as I found out, I not only arranged for her to do it, but I happened to be teaching the Mills history course at that time. This was the first time. So I asked Kathy to come talk to the class just about her experience as a student at Mills in the late 1960s. And she told the story about Yale announcing that it was going co-ed in 1968. And she said the talk in all the dorms was, are you transferring to Yale? And it was a little bit of a joke, but she said quite a number of students did. And this was the point. In the early 20th century, you, as a young woman in the Bay Area, you didn't have a lot of options. By the second half of the 20th century, you've got Yale going co-ed, and not just Yale, but quite a number of others. You've got the state universities, Universities of Michigan, as I mentioned, others, receiving more federal money, more state money, expanding their programs. Air transportation is much more accessible and affordable. And this creates challenges for Mills and for a lot of the other women's colleges as well. When I started at Mills in 1969, there was some 300 women's colleges, women-only colleges in the United States. There are now, last I heard, there are now about 30. And the world changes, and Mills changes, as we'll see, changes with it. The curriculum at Mills was largely, especially after the Second World War, home economics. The president of the college was Lynn White, who encouraged students to take liberal arts courses. He's had something of a bad rep in that he's been criticized for saying, well, women belong in the kitchen. He was actually quoted in an article that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post in the 1950s about women, educating women to be wives and mothers. And in fact, I had a conversation with him years later about this. And he said, yes, I thought, and I still think women should be trained to be wives and mothers, but that doesn't mean that women should have careers and do other things. Anyway, that was his perspective. So here you have home economics being taught at Mills, and in Kimball House, which I'll show you in just a minute. And I like this picture particularly because this room became my office for quite a number of years. The social science division was housed in Kimball House, and the sewing machines weren't there. Instead, all kinds of history books. This is Kimball House, and this is the room you were just looking at before. Purchased, it was a private home. It was purchased in 1921. It was down Seminary Avenue. It was moved onto the campus, became the home of the music department, later home ec, as you saw, then social sciences. Social sciences moved to a new building almost 20 years ago, and now it's Kimball House is the Graduate School of Education Administrative Offices. But again, I show you the picture, walk around and see it in, not only because I personally spent, it seems the better part of my life in this building, but also the trees and the shrubbery, and you get a feel for the campus. Beanies, I mentioned the Reinhardt Alumni House collection before. These are beanies from the different years. There are 4 class year colors. Each class has its own color. So 1938 was green, for example. 52 was orange. 31 was either blue or white, I'm not quite sure. And all of these, you see traditions that come out of the past, and many of that which are still continued as ways of trying to sort of connect with the past, although as I'll indicate, Mills has changed very much over recent years. So even in the 1950s, we're beginning to see more in terms of political action, political perspectives. Martin Luther King gave a lecture at Mills in 1958, and you see King here, Dr. King photographed, pictured with 4 of the students who were talking to him after his talk, asking him questions. So Martin Luther King came to Mills. John F. Kennedy is senator by October 59. It was clear he was, if not formally running for president, he was certainly beginning his campaign. And here you see him on the campus visiting in October of 1959. Looks like that's the library in the background. Students watching TV in Alderwood Hall. Alderwood Hall is now, as I mentioned, the Judy Morgan School for Girls. Again, the lifestyle of the students was very different. This is 1968. Crest was published, it was a magazine published by the actually a book, an annual book published by the Associated Students. So here you have just some pictures of some of the students and their graduation years, 1970, 71. Pat Campbell was actually in a couple of my classes. We remain in touch occasionally. And here you have the students in Alderwood watching, watching television. And you can see from the dress, just by the way these young women are dressed, how things have changed stylistically. Of course, TVs are replaced now by the internet. And of course, we have a much greater proportion of our students living off the campus. Well, the politics changes, the student body changes. Students protesting, wanting African-American students wanting to institute a Black Studies program or Black Studies courses at Mills, and there was some resistance from the part of the president and others. And in March of 1969, students together with the Black Panthers, some of the Black Panthers, of course, in East Oakland nearby, occupied the president's office. And pictured above on the right, you see Kathleen Cleaver. She and Eldridge Cleaver participated in this, and she gave a speech at Mills that helped precipitate a sit-in. The next year, in 1970, an ethnic studies department was created, which is now one of the larger departments at Mills, as the ethnic population of the student body has changed as well. Stephanie Mills was the class valedictorian in graduation ceremonies in the spring of 1969. And she gave a talk, and this is a quote from her. This got national attention. "I'm terribly saddened by the fact that the most humane thing for me to do is to have no children at all. But the piper is finally demanding payment." She was very conscious of ecology, and she did a lot and has done a lot in the decades since then to write about ecological concerns, things like global warming, which we weren't talking about in 69 and 70, but she could see it. She could see some of these issues, and she was very much interested in promoting a sensitivity. So you can see the atmosphere changing somewhat. And we're sort of coming to our conclusion. What all of these things meant was that Mills was struggling to maintain its niche. The women earlier, the generations earlier of younger women who could whose families could afford to pay to send them to Mills had shifted. The opportunities were very different. Currently, I don't know the current statistics, but the last I knew, a year or two ago, I think there was something like 1% of the students at Mills actually paying the full freight, and everyone else receiving some sort of financial assistance, some from the college, some from private sources, some from government programs. So what this meant was that the college was in financial difficulties, has been now for decades. And in 1990, May of 1990, the Board of Trustees decided, they made a decision to make Mills co-ed, and the students went on strike. And this was reported literally around the world. And here you see the students striking, opposing the move to co-ed, and then ultimately the board rescinding its decision. And this is still referred to at Mills today among students as, in quotes, the strike. Somebody talks about the strike, and immediately they're talking about this situation in the spring of 1990. So, as I say, a number of the colleges were going co-ed. I've just mentioned a few of them here that you can see, and so it has been and remains a struggle. 1970s feminism, of course, Mills being a women's college, and Janet Holmgren, the president, you see pictured over here, inviting speakers such as Gloria Steinem. This is a picture that was taken on campus in 2007. So a greater, I would say, a more intense sentiment of political change, be it women's issues, feminist movements, be it ecology, being it getting underrepresented ethnic groups onto the campus, all of this changing at a time when the college is struggling to sort of find its niche. New buildings that are built, however, the Betty Irene Moore Natural Sciences building, there was an older building that was sort of incorporated into this new building in 2007. And more recently, the Larry Loke Graduate School of Business. In 2001, Mills launched a BA MBA program. So Mills has a graduate program, but the MBA program is now 20 years old, and a student could apply to Mills, get her BA, and then go on and continue for another year and get the MBA as well. So this is the new building, and you can see how different the architecture is. So Mills is still there, and just speaking from personal experience, I'm still teaching a class there. Students are, you couldn't ask for better students than I've been privileged to teach at Mills. The problems continue, and if you follow current events, you may know, and I think Emily mentioned this very briefly at the beginning, the talk about partnering with Northeastern. And this, I just took a clip from KR on TV this past June. Pardon me, this is Mills commencement, and this is the newscaster, of course, talking about it. What this actually means really remains to be seen. So in some ways, and again, I don't have inside information about the details. I think the details, many of the details are still needing to be worked out. One of the results undoubtedly would be if Northeastern students can come to Mills, which is probably part of it. It means the college becoming co-ed in some form or another. As I've said before, the history of Mills going back to 1852 has been changed. And so the future of Mills is going to be changed as well. So again, I want to thank you for your attention. I think we can have Q&A. Emily?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a few questions in the chat. If other people have questions, you can either raise your hand on the Zoom, or you can type them into the chat and I'll read them out. But we'll start with the ones that are already there, which are back from the very early part of the program.
Yeah, I have the chat open. I can see it. If you want to read it, I don't know if everybody's, maybe you want to read it so everybody can hear the question.
Yeah, we'll read it so it's on the recording too.
Okay, fine.
So someone asked, what happened with the Benicia site first?
The Benicia site, there is a plaque at the Benicia site. In fact, I was almost tempted to show it as I took a picture of it on a visit to Benicia once, but I had to cut down from about 500 images or whatever. So the Benicia site is still there. It's been built up. It's part of, it's part of a park, actually. There's a park in Benicia right along the river, or the estuary. The river, I guess, is the best word for it. It's been a long time since I was there. And so that area is still parkland, and there is a plaque that talks about the young ladies' seminary that in 1871 moved to Mills. Let's see, how long was Mary Atkins away before returning to run the seminary? Do we know why she returned? It's a very interesting question, and I didn't really go into it in great detail, but she returned. I have a sense, and I'm basing this on some of the reading I've done about Mary Atkins, that she was relatively restless sort of soul at one time. Let's see, just the chronology. Pardon me. She turned, as I indicated before, she turned the seminary over in 1866. She had gotten divorced, and that may have played a factor in her wanting to move on. She then remarried and reclaimed the Benicia Seminary. And as I said, interestingly enough, when I first started doing the Mills history, I didn't realize that the Benicia Seminary continued to exist, and it was run by Mary Atkins for quite some time. And as I recall, yeah, the seminary finally closed in 1882. Excuse me, 1886. In 1886, and Mary Atkins passed away in 1882. I don't have in front of me, and I don't recall exactly when she gave up running the seminary, but it was not too long before her death. There were a couple of other people who ran it, who were men, by the way, as far as I can recall. And then the seminary, as I indicated, continued in Benicia until 1911. So she was away, to get to the question, she was away from 1866, really meaningfully, she was away for, well, about 11 years, 10 or 11 years. Where was the reconstituted seminary located? It was located, again, near the water, near the, forgetting the name of the body of water, pardon me. You cross over to get to Benicia, but it was located right on the water. And was there separate enrollment? Yes, it was a completely separate school. It was completely separate. And as I say, it passed out of existence in 1886. And so far as I know, well, there's some short histories of it, but nobody really, the interest really was the college and Mills more so than the seminary. And as I say, when you look at the history material and history of Mills, there isn't really an awful lot about the seminary. I had to kind of dig a little bit. Okay, I don't see any of the questions in the chat. Emily, am I missing any?
No, I don't see any. Does anyone else want to jump in and ask anything?
I can end the slideshow and go back to, let's see, go back to, okay, I'll stop the share. Okay, so we can actually see people, presumably. We'll close the chat. Okay, yeah, if anybody has questions.
Yeah, and if not, we can go ahead and end. Oh, Dorothy, my coworker, has a question. Do you want to? Do you want to use this?
Yes. Hi, Professor Gordon.
Hello. I can see part of you and hear. Oh, there you are. Okay. Hello.
Hi. I just think it's interesting that Mills is located where it is, or I should say, I think it's interesting that Beulah, the small town of Beulah that became incorporated in Oakland in 1909 in that last annexation, was right next to a seminary, because Beulah was a town that was kind of started by missionaries of the Montgomerys. And so I just think it's just interesting that that little piece of what would become Oakland had such a long and rich history of missionaries. And there still is a missionary retreat in the neighborhood it was kind of like the southern part of the Laurel neighborhood now. But anyway, I just wanted to throw it out there that Beulah, and as you showed on your map, there's a Beulah station. That whole little area was called Beulah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to say that.
No, it's a fascinating history. It really is. And the part of the area around Laurel that you're talking about, I just happened to find in getting some stuff ready for this talk. Where was it? I was looking for something else online, and I found this. It was a 1924 advertisement for people to buy land in an area that is sort of, I guess, in the Laurel district, the Laurel area, that Mills College was selling.
Yes.
And probably too much trouble to call up the map again. But anyway, if you know where the Wetmore Gate is, that side where Seminary kind of runs into MacArthur.
Yes.
The territory, I'm gesturing with my hands as if anybody can see, but the territory, the land to the west of that, on the other side of what's now MacArthur Boulevard, which was originally Hopkins Street, as I recall. Anyway, that land was owned by Mills, a good chunk of it anyway. And then the college in 1924, and I didn't know this until recently, the college in 1924 put that up for sale. And so there's a real estate company that was offering, to sell lots on behalf of Mills. And they had pictures of houses, come buy a lot here. I think the lots were selling for $900 each or something like that. Imagine $900 for a lot near the Mills campus right now.
It would be terrific, but it's not likely to ever happen.
It would be a good deal, yeah. Anyway, so, and that area then was built up around then. But the history, one of the things that's interesting in talking about the history of Mills, of course, is to talk about the history of the surrounding areas as well, because the neighborhoods are so varied as well. The freeway makes a big difference. It really does over time as far as the students' interaction with the neighborhood. And then again, on the other side of Seminary, so I'm trying to picture now, this would be in the direction towards San Leandro on the other side of Seminary Avenue, you get pretty early on a growing African-American community and sort of very mixed community. And it'd be an interesting project would be to focus on the interactions between the college, well, even the seminary, and then the college more recently, and the communities around it, because there's a very interesting story to be told there, I think.
Sure.
I hope I'm speaking to your point.
Yeah, well, yeah, I also Mills absorbed the home for aged and infirm colored people.
That's right.
That's on the campus on Underwood.
That's right.
And as far as African Americans and the relationship, I have a friend who started a tennis program on the Mills campus exclusively for kids in the neighborhood to not so much just introduce them to tennis, but to the game of tennis, but to introduce them to the college itself, you know, as they live, you know, a few blocks away. And he remembers living in the Millsmont area adjacent to the campus and never going on the Mills campus. And he said, wouldn't it be great if little girls in this neighborhood could see what was going on there? So props to Vincent Owens.
And I've heard this from other people too, black and white and whatever. But when we talk about that, I was very privileged in the sense when I first came to Mills, this was again in the fall of '69, that was when they were beginning to put in the ethnic studies program. And one of the courses that they wanted to do was a course essentially on the sociology of the African-American community. So they hired somebody from Santa Cruz, from UC Santa Cruz, and apparently they didn't have office space for him. So he was put in my office and we shared an office for about a year. And this was Herman Blake, who later became the provost, dean at the Oaks College at Santa Cruz. And he was teaching this course and he would come up from Santa Cruz once a week and have office hours after, either before or after his class, I don't recall. And the students would just line up to talk to him. And he was working at the time on a book with Huey Newton. So he knew all of these people and he knew them quite well and was friendly with them. And I would have occasionally an opportunity to chat with him, not too many, because he was always busy talking to students and I'd be sitting there listening. And it was really something of an education. And then he moved on, he became president of Tugelo. We kept in touch for years and years. He's retired now. But it was one of the ways for me, inadvertently, I had no idea at that time. I'm probably giving you a longer response than you wanted.
No,
but
it's fine.
I had no idea at that time that I'd ever be doing the history of the college, but it was really an introduction to the history of the college and a little bit of the history of the community too.
I'm wondering if anyone wants to share their memories of Mills, if there are no more questions. Are there any more questions? Oh, there are some questions.
Oh, okay, let's go for it by all means.
Do the bells of the Campanile still ring?
Yes, they do as of, let's see, the last time I was on campus was a week or two ago. Yeah, they still ring. You can hear them, and not only can you hear them, but you can hear them on campus, excuse me, but you can also hear them in the immediate neighborhood. And I've talked to people at times, who live very close to the campus, a block or two away, and who talk about hearing the bells. They go off every 15 minutes. And I remember one person saying, it was very good. I never have to look at my wristwatch. I always know what time it is.
Anyway, I'm going to give the moderation of this program back over to Emily. Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Sure.
All right, so I couldn't hear what was just happening, but did you already address the question about Hawaiian students coming to Mills?
No, I did not. Was there a question?
Yeah, it says, I've read a bit about Hawaiian students coming to Mills, which you spoke about a little bit. Would you be able to provide any more information about that? Yeah,
well, early on, remember that Mills started with Cyrus and Susan, who had spent years in Hawaii as missionaries. So there were some Hawaiian students, not so far as I know, and I don't have a huge amount of information on this, but not a huge number, but small numbers all the way through to the point where I know I've had students in classes who were from Hawaii. And I'm not talking, I wasn't there when Cyrus and Susan Mills were there, but they're there for a while, but not quite that long. And I remember at least one or two of the students telling me that there were a number of students from Hawaii, and I remember one or two of them at different times saying something to the effect that we get together every once in a while and talk a little bit about Hawaii and the fact that there's a legacy here at Mills from students coming from Hawaii. I can't really give you statistics, but from what I know, it was a relatively small number all the way through, but there definitely was a contingent of students from Hawaii, yeah.
And then Karen Pear, if I'm saying that right, says, thank you, Dr. Gordon. I took history class from you in 1990, and I'm now teaching history at Cal State East Bay. So
fantastic. Oh, well, thank you. Karen, what courses did you take? What did you take? Are you still there?
Hi, yeah. Hi, Dr. Gordon. I think it was European history.
Well,
I remember reading, some very depressing book. Was it Rilke or? It was like modern Europe. And you were talking about creating a class on cooking, on food, you wanted to create a class based on your food tours of Europe. So,
I did.
I was there during the strike, graduated in 91.
Okay.
And then I went on to Rutgers.
To where?
To Rutgers.
That's my school.
Oh, yeah. I talked to you about it.
I'm sure we must have. That's where I got my PhD, yeah.
That's where I went. They're top ranked women's history department in the country.
That's right. That's right. At the time that I was a graduate student there, we had, there were a couple of women graduate students. I hate to have to put it in this way. One of them went on, and was she teaching now at the University of North Carolina, Duke, Claudia Kuntz, Claudia Kuntz, who wrote the book called Women in the Fatherland. I think that's the exact title of it.
Mothers in the Fatherland. Yeah.
Mothers, thank you, Mothers in the Fatherland. And she was in. We were in the seminar together, at least one of the seminars together. But yeah, in terms of 1991, because one of the areas I worked in was food history, cuisine history. And I did do a course. In fact, when I first came to Mills, no, it may have been the year afterward, in the early 1970s, Mills had a January program, which they've somewhat revived in recent years. But in the January program, and I don't know if they were doing this, I don't think they were doing this when you were a student. I think it had stopped by then. The January program, students would take one course, and theoretically they could concentrate on just that one course, and you could do things out of class time because you figured, well, the students have no other competing things in their time, which of course wasn't true because quite a number of students worked and they couldn't necessarily just go off and do whatever. Anyway, so I was fairly new and I was trying to impress people and see what could I contribute. And I had worked as a graduate student doing food history, among other things. And so I introduced a course in cuisine history, and we would go out to eat in different restaurants. And I would try to arrange with the people who ran the restaurants that they would structure a dinner according to something historical. That was the hardest thing of all, because some of these people had no idea what I was talking about. And for example, you go to an Italian restaurant, and you can't have red sauce because tomato sauce was introduced from the Americas. And I wanted them to learn about earlier Italian food. And so I remember one restaurateur, how can I give you food with, spaghetti or pasta and not use tomato sauce? I said, well, pretend it's 1300. And we eventually worked it out. But yeah, that was a lot of fun. And that was cuisine history. And I've continued to work in that area for a while, and I taught that course. And then when giving you much too long-winded answer, I suspect. But then when the January term was ended, and there were problems with it, it was too bad because it was really a very interesting experience. But when it was ended, the college said, we encourage faculty who taught courses in January to convert them into regular semester courses. And almost nobody did. But I took that food history course and converted it into a regular semester course and then offered it every couple of years. And so you were in that class?
No, you weren't offering it while I was there.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
But
or I probably would have taken it.
Yeah, if you graduated in 91, I was away for the academic year 89, 90, which of course is when the strike occurred. Yeah.
Yeah, I was there for the strike. Yeah.
So Karen, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but since you were there for the strike, do you want to say a few words about what that really looked like? Like, what were the students doing for the strike?
It was amazing. It was, we were sleeping outside, occupying buildings, having nightly meetings where we worked together on what the next day's events would be. The people who were running it were experts at managing the media. We had the French professor driving around campus in his Volkswagen bus painted with pas de boys on the side and, no boys. It was an excellent experience, and I'm so sorry to see that our hard work is now kind of irrelevant because we're going to be co-ed. But I appreciate hearing Dr. Gordon again because it reminds me of what an excellent education I got at Mills.
Well, if I can just add a comment very quickly. One of the student I knew very well who had taken some classes with me was Melissa Stevenson Dial, who was one of the leaders. And of course, when I got back, I got together and I learned a lot. It was funny to miss the strike, to miss all of that. When I first came back to Mills, I'd been away for more than a year and in France almost all that time. And no, that's not true. I spent 2 months in Spain. In fact, I learned about the strike from the Israeli ambassador to Spain, but that's another story. Anyway, I went to Spain because I wanted to learn enough Spanish to justify my teaching a course in the history of Spain, but that's a whole different subject. But anyway, when I got back to Mills, and the buildings were familiar, my office was still there, a lot of people I knew, but gradually, and it took a while, maybe a week or 2 weeks, gradually I got a feeling of a different vibe, to put it in today's terms, a little different feeling that I think was a result of the strike. People were more politically, when I say politically on campus, that is more politically sensitized. I just had the feeling it wasn't exactly the same place that I had left. Fascinating story. So Karen, wait a second, where are you teaching now, did you say?
Cal State East Bay.
Oh, okay, sure.
Used to be Cal State Hayward.
No, how well I know. Are you familiar with their Osher Lifelong Learning Institute program?
Yeah, they're out in the Concord campus mainly. And I don't really drive out to the Concord campus anymore. I teach, well, I'm all online now. No, I'm asking you because starting next week, I'll be doing a course for them on the history of Russia. Oh, neat.
Online, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the commute's okay when it's online.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I learned a lot from you, and I got a fellowship to Rutgers and went to learn women's history, and now I teach women's history. So.
No, that's fantastic. That really is, and it's really both an honor and a delight to touch base with you again. And I would say if this pandemic ever ends, we should get together for lunch or something like that.
Sounds good.
So I'm going to say it's about time for us to end. I do want to read out, Veronica has put in the chat, as a student who graduated there in 2012, thank you to Karen for striking. I still value the experience I was able to have, partly because of your work. So it wasn't totally irrelevant. You got a few more decades after 1990 of women's only college.
If I can just add something very, very briefly, because I wanted to say something to Karen and you reminded me of it. I would say that there's a legacy, and that legacy will continue even with whatever changes occur. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I think that the legacy of Mills is so powerful. You're an example of it, and so many other people are as well, that even with these changes occurring, that legacy will live on. I like to think so.
I hope so.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Professor Gordon, for being here. Thank you everyone for coming. I've put a link in the chat where you can go to register for tomorrow night's program, which is the last one in our fall history series about Park Van Tassel, early Oakland balloonist. Should be an exciting program. And thanks again. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
And we'll go ahead and end.